Welcome back to the Civilnet podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott. I'm joined today by a friend of the show, political commentator, Mr. Eric Hacopian. Eric, thanks for coming on again.
Thank you very much.
So let's talk about essentially the ever-dynamic political situation, mostly coming from the United States, which is going to have, repercussions for the entire global order at this point. Let's start with some context. How did we get to where we're at today? What explains the Trump phenomenon?
Well, I think, first of all, unfortunately, we got to step back about 20 to 40 years for 5 minutes before we can continue, because there's a setup for it. What we've seen in American politics and in American society is what I call the great unraveling. And in many ways, it started with the deindustrialization process in the 80s, when a lot of traditional actually entire towns were essentially destroyed in the Midwest of the United States and in other places, deindustrialized. But that was essentially affecting still as a minority of people, specifically working class men. And that sort of extended and into 2001, after post 9/11, the population has perceived the country to be in pointless wars for almost 20 years that has cost trillions of dollars. And thousands of lives of U.S. troops, and has absolutely brought nothing to the country. That was combined with the 2008 financial crash, in which essentially the banks were saved while ordinary people were left to fend for themselves. And followed that up with the COVID disaster and the inflation that came after it. You had a situation in which the vital center of the country, the sort of the political establishment, has lost all credibility. That is combined with a fact which is almost a revolutionary thing in the United States. Is, as you know, the United States is not a country that's held together by ethnicity or by race or by national identity. Now, national identity, in a way, is a collective identity based on the presumption of economic progress. People come to the United States and have come to the United States for hundreds of years with a bargain. And the bargain is you sort of forget where you come from, you become an American, and your children will live better than you will. For the past 20 years, that's really no longer true. And what you have today is the first generation of Americans and the first generation of parents who understand that, I'm talking about the bottom 80%. Obviously, the top 10 or 20% is always different. In fact, they've done tremendously well because you have massive inequalities. The bottom 80% has figured out politically that their children will not do as well as they will. In fact, they'll have less economic prospects, and you see this in things like housing specifically. I don't know who can actually own a home if you live in a municipal area. Things have become unaffordable. So you have an establishment that is in many ways corrupt, self-serving, and has betrayed the population. And this outburst is a pushback against that. And you essentially had two manifestations of this. There was the right-wing manifestation of it, which is a different kind of right-wing, which is the Trump phenomenon, the MAGA phenomenon, which became successful. And you had the equivalent left-wing one, which was the Bernie Sanders movement, which was actually crushed in March of 2020 by the Democratic political establishment. So now you have the situation where one of the insurgent movements has essentially taken over the country and is running it in a way that has never been run before, and is in complete opposition and war with essentially the totality of the American political establishment.
One key element I want your opinion on that I feel like you've glossed over is, I would say, a part of the hydra, right, is that this political polarization that comes from just this complete loss of what objective reality is, whether it's social media heightening things. You have, of course, the American society has been, let's just say for all intents and purposes, not politically, but culturally somewhat conservative. Mm-hmm. And then the pendulum has swung to such a degree that all of a sudden, kids have 51 different genders, and there's the oppression Olympics, and there's, and again, maybe these things are not as widespread as they seem on social media, but there's kind of this impression, right? And so now there's this Trump pushback, especially led by Elon Musk, which is against all the diversity stuff and the political correctness that had been suffocated in American society.
It's a very good point. It's what I call the Weimar America.
Yeah.
And that does not mean that people who are MAGA are Nazis. I'm not implying that.
No.
But it's the setup is that. It's this social diffusion of traditional norms and traditional habits, and the ridiculousness of many of these things. You know, someone claims to be a cat. You know, that kind of thing. This might be 5 people, but obviously social media has a way of exasperating it. And obviously, and the one that I didn't mention, which I'm glad you brought up, is obviously immigration. Yeah. Because immigration, which has radically transformed the country demographically, is not something that many people are comfortable with demographic changes. Now, you can judge them, not judge them, but that's besides the point. But the reality is the country has become far more diverse than it has ever been. And a lot of people don't like that. And given the fact that, you know, literally millions of people have showed up and essentially crossed the country's borders and applied for asylum, even though almost in 95% of these cases, these people's lives are really not in danger. They're essentially economic migrants. So I think that there was a sense of lack of control, that essentially the adults in the room are not the adults in the room, and the country was out of control. And you needed a strong hand, someone who doesn't believe in the niceties of politics. He could be crass, he could be crude, but he's our crass and crude person. So I think, yes, that's a very good point. And I think that was what you're describing. What I was describing was the hardware of what brought us to this moment. What you brought up, which is this cultural atmosphere, was the software that made all of this happen.
But do you see this shift in a vacuum, as in it's unique to the United States, or does it have some kind of some equivalent? I mean, for the first time since World War II, you have what are ostensibly far-right parties sitting in every single European parliament, from west to east. It's a really interesting shift because, you know, this is exactly 10 years after the great migrant crisis of 2015.
Absolutely. The one thing that we do know is that European politics is going to move right. In fact, it's going to move dramatically right.
It is already. We're seeing it already.
I mean, and I think what's going to happen is that, and we're going to see this in Germany with the new Christian Democrat chancellor, which is almost certain to be elected in a few weeks, Friedrich Merz, I think, Friedrich Merz. In which I suspect what he will do is he will keep AfD, or try to keep AfD, the far-right party, out of the coalition while implementing the entirety of the AfD agenda.
Well, they're already taking a harsh stance. I mean, you had the Swedish foreign minister, who herself was brandishing, refugees welcome signs 10 years ago, is now publicly stating that if Islam doesn't fit into Sweden, you have no place here. Which is radical shift. Who people who would have called regular Swedes racist a decade ago for even voicing these concerns, you're seeing it, and
you see
it's interesting to see, right?
I mean, it's obvious that the entire European the immigration system in Europe, and the not legal immigration into Europe has, which is, by the way, just one thing that Vance said, is that no one ever voted for this. It's absolutely true. You cannot have millions of people. Obviously, this is not a comment on all Muslims, by the way, because they're not even all Muslims. Yeah. You cannot have millions of people that refuse to integrate, or don't have the cultural capacity or the education to integrate, and want to live in ghettos, become productive members of a society when that's not what they're interested in, and or maybe they're simply not culturally capable of it. And as you know, you come from Canada, I come from the United States. Those countries are far more capable of taking and integrating people into. You can create a Canadian and an American very quickly. You cannot create a German or a Swede very quickly. So that integration process is not what European countries are set up for historically, because they're nation states that frankly have had peace in many ways because they didn't have diversity. No one likes to talk about that. But the post-World War II peace was really based on not necessarily tolerance, but like not having people living beyond your borders in great numbers.
Yeah, I would say, and we will come back to Vance's speech because it's an important one, and we'll shift gears back to the U.S. I think the U.S. actually uniquely suited, much more so than Canada, especially the last 10 years in Canada. But what makes the U.S. so capable of absorbing large numbers of people. I mean, you mentioned, it's unprecedented. I don't know how much I agree. I don't know the proportions that well, but you did also have, during the Civil War, you had just mass waves of Irish coming in. And, the whole movie gangs in New York, right? You had this exact same backlash, but they were integrated into American society. The U.S. has a much stronger ability to do so because it's an ideological country. It's not, as you said, it's not an ethno state. It's based on the common ideology that you become American. And this brings us to Trump, right? We have his first month in office. It feels like he's your guy, right? He's not the best, but he's your guy. He's American. He's a rags to riches story. He's flaunting his wealth. What does his first month in office look like?
I think the Trump phenomenon, and if you look at the first month, they are not a normal administration coming into power. This is a revolutionary movement, and it's a revolutionary movement in the sense that it's a reactionary revolutionary movement, but it's a revolutionary movement nonetheless. This is about dismantling systems. It's about destroying things. People think that there's mass chaos and stupidity. That the chaos is by design. So everything that they've done seems crazy, but it is not crazy from their point of view because they want to dismantle the administrative state for very simple reasons. Is because American politics at this stage in history has really been reduced to two factions. It is the corporatist factions, which are come from both parties, which are about serving corporate interests. And what is it about corporate interests? Corporatist parties need rules, regulations, because that's what corporations need. You need systems. It's a war between the corporatists and the oligarchs. It is symbolically, when you look at Trump's inauguration and you have the three people that are standing behind him are three tech billionaires that are worth $1 trillion collectively, or nearly $1 trillion.
The richest men on the planet standing right behind him.
So this is a push by the oligarchic. It's to create an oligarchic system in the United States to replace a corporatist one. And a corporatist one that you can like it or dislike it was literally the greatest empire in the history of the world as far as its capacity to do things. But these are not people who are interested in that. They're interested in unraveling systems. And in fact, unraveling and being disruptive, as you know, is the zeitgeist of the IT industry. So these people all come out of IT. There's a part of it with what Musk is doing, which is actually, he couldn't do anything else because that's what he's done all of his life. So I think what this is this is a war between the oligarchics and the corporatists, but it's almost certain that the oligarchic win is very likely to win because these people are ideological. They have a set of ideas and agendas, and most specifically what they hate and who they hate. While this other side is essentially a political nothing. It's a bunch of career politicians without any ideas or convictions and are not willing to fight or die for anything. So a small committed minority of ideologically driven people, unless there's massive circumstances that screw it up, whether it's like economic downturns that are significant, will essentially override the political establishment because their job is frankly a lot easier because they're not about building anything. They're about dismantling things, and they're actually dismantling things very quickly.
I'm not endorsing this in any way, but it reminds me of that passage in the Bible that said you were neither hot nor cold, you were lukewarm, and so I spat you out.
No.
It's like this political class that
they're nothing.
They appeal to no one because they try to be everything to everyone, and they've been discredited over the last few years. It's a strange state of affairs. We had, of course, Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference just a couple of days ago, which really rocked the boat significantly. And this was honestly, not, in my opinion, not a inaccurate, let's say, not even criticism, but just a condemnation of the state of Europe today. I mean, as Armenians especially. I mean, you had Aliyev who ethnically cleansed 120,000 of our people, and then the next month flew to Germany and shook hands with Olaf Scholz. I mean, this is just no consequences. You have, of course, von der Leyen, who's calling the Aliyev regime a reliable partner of Europe. This is a continent that for the last 100 years needed young Canadian and American men, and of course Brits and Poles and French, to storm their beaches 3 times in the last 100 years to free them from tyranny, and they learn nothing. They're already talking about resuming gas supplies to Europe in the event of peace with Ukraine. It's crazy. So he gave this speech, scared everyone. What's your take?
I think there's 3 specific things. As far as the content of the speech, just pure content. There was a lot of things that he said which are true. When he talks about freedom of speech being under attack in Europe,
Absolutely.
he's absolutely true. There's no question about that. When he talks about out of control immigration and the impact that nobody voted for this, again, absolutely true. Yeah. Europe doing more for its defense, absolutely true. There's many other things. I mean, he talked for a long time that are not necessarily true. They're exaggerations that, as far as Ukraine and all of these things.
The Romanian elections.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the Romanian election that he's the key thing with the Romanian, his Romanian reference and what this is about, this really marginal figure that was propped up, we don't know how, possibly with Russian help, to come out of nowhere and get 22% and make the runoff, and then they go and cancel the elections, which, by the way, I do not think is a good idea. You're much better off exposing people in a runoff of who this person is rather than canceling elections. His comment there was really not about Romania. It was actually about Germany and AfD. Because immediately after the speech, he meets with the head of the AfD. It's very clear that they do not want the AfD to be banned as a party or be given a legitimate shot to be part of government, which is a much more complicated thing. So as far as the content of it goes, he's not wrong. There's many things that he's correct about, but we need to step back. And the step back is, this was literally an ideological speech. This was not a normal foreign policy speech. What he essentially is establishing is that the Trump administration wants to run, or wants to lead some kind of a new right Comintern, where it's like there's an international of like-minded people, whether it's Orban, whether it's the guy from Romania, whether it's AfD, and they will impose their will politically to empower these people against who they see as their ideological enemies. That is remarkable, because American politicians tend to be not ideological in that extent, but he is coming to someone else's house and essentially saying that we are going to support, or we're going to advocate for people that you hate. So that's a remarkable thing. The third one is the European response to this. That's the after effect of it. First of all, the level of disrespect is immense. If any kind of a European politician had come to the United States and made a speech about internal U.S. issues like this, that person would be banned for life. They would be thrown out of the country, unceremoniously, and attacked by every faction in the country. The fact that he can come and make a speech like this that is designed specifically to be disrespectful, that was not unintentional, has created a situation. And I think there's an Armenian official who told me that Europeans today, after the speech, are like what Armenians were after the 20 War. You don't know where you're at. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know who your enemies are. So it's actually quite a remarkable thing. So there's an ideological aspect, which is amazing. There's the content of the speech, which is, again, he's as correct as he's wrong on different matters. And then there's the post-effect of it on Europeans, and just the level of sheer disrespect. Because no one takes Europeans seriously, the EU as an institution, and people think they can come there and say whatever they want without consequences, which is actually true.
So Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine within a day of being elected. He famously went on the Joe Rogan podcast and stated that he'll do 2 things. I'll call Vladimir Putin and I'll say, Vladimir, you got it. Well, I can't actually say what I'm going to say because, and then he rambled. So I still don't know what his 2-step plan is. But there's an interesting kind of tug of war going on where they announced he spoke directly to the Russians. They agreed on this meeting in Riyadh. The Ukrainians got upset, and then now they're backtracking, kind of assuring Ukraine that they'll be involved. Now they all just flow. As of recording this, they've all just landed in Riyadh essentially. What is your assessment on the prospects for peace, and what would that mean at this stage with Russia having met none of their real objectives, but having gain a significant foothold in eastern Ukraine?
No one is smart enough to answer this question because there is far too many variables. Because there's only one thing that we can be sure of: Trump and his team hate Ukraine and hate Zelensky, and they hate Ukraine and Zelensky because for them, Ukraine is the cognitive symbol of everything that they hate about the world order. And for specific reasons, Trump actually thinks that Zelensky was involved in defeating him in 2020 and in not helping him against Biden. With Trump, everything is personal.
Yeah.
So
he tried to withhold U.S. This is important for context. He tried to withhold U.S. aid as a matter of foreign policy in his personal battle against Biden because Zelensky refused to provide information.
They have absolutely, there's a crude English phrase that starts with F of doing that to Ukraine is absolutely not a problem for them because they see that regime, the man who runs it, as an ideological enemy, and that this is a worthless, useless war that distracts the United States from the bigger conflicts, and the U.S. doesn't need to be part of it. Now, do they have the capacity to end the war? Yes and no, because if significant amounts of actually aid to Ukraine has actually come from Europe, and if that continues, even if the U.S. is walking out, that doesn't mean the war ends. So they're going to have a hard. If he's going to sit down and make some deal with Putin, and then everyone else has to accept it, that may not hold. And that also assumes that Vladimir Putin and the Russians don't overplay their hand. In a way, the Russian elite want Trump to save them from their leader, who is entirely delusional about the capacity of his country, and to the extent that they're winning in Ukraine. Yes, in a very technical sense, the Russians are winning in Ukraine because they're slowly, at great cost, advancing here and there. I think it's like 40 soldiers per square kilometer, that kind of advance, sort of a meat grinder. But they actually lost the real war and all of its consequences, economic, long-term, and all of that in the first month of the war. So I don't know what victory means. So you could have a situation in which one side or the other overplays their hand. And it could very well be that the Russians, given the fact that Trump has essentially made every concession off the bat, what is there that he needs to give up at this point to get a peace deal if you're saying the primary things that he wants have already been given to him? So nobody knows what this will lead to. And Trump is also entirely unpredictable. He can turn around at an unreasonable Putin and lash out, no matter what he thinks of the Ukrainians. So saying you want to end the war is not necessarily being able to end the war. He can cut U.S. aid. He can demand, the rare earth minerals and all of these.
Which he's doing.
Which is what he's doing. Right? At the end of the day, there's no U.S. soldiers in Ukraine. So if the Ukrainians want to continue and the Europeans are willing to pay the bill for it, the war can continue. So the U.S. can't end this war at fiat because if you're already saying, I'm not going to give you anything, what leverage do you have over the country? And that's not even saying that there's not going to be pushback among the U.S. establishment itself, which despite the fact that they're under retreat, they are not without their capacity to respond. So what happens in these negotiations, no one is smart enough to know, because you essentially, if you want to know what's going to happen, you have to get into the mind of Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership, which at this point, anybody who tells you they know what they're thinking is not speaking the truth.
One thing that's important to point out is that the common myth, right, is that the U.S. is just sending tons and tons of money to Ukraine. But what they're actually doing is they're sending them credits that they can then use to purchase American manufactured weaponry.
Doesn't leave the United States. The money doesn't leave the United States.
Right. So there's a huge military-industrial interest to maintain this war, actually. So we'll have to see. And Trump is a big business guy and a big made in America guy. So let's see what that's going to look like. Zelensky gave a speech in response to this, to Trump's peace deal that's ostensibly went over his head. What did he really mean? What did he say, and what did he really mean?
Well, it was a remarkable speech. It's actually as remarkable as Vance's speech, because Zelensky, the leader of the poorest country in Europe, actually spoke like the leader of Europe, which is fascinating. In so many words, he called the Trump administration the agents of Russia within NATO, because he said Russia is in NATO via a country. Well, which country is that? He could be, I don't think he's referring to Hungary.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe he means Orban.
So I think it was a remarkable speech. And if Europe had real leaders, that's the speech they would give to slap back at a foreigner coming into your country, or your countries saying something like that. So, and he, in so many words, said there's no ending anything without us. And that we need to be part of the process, and nothing's going to be done over our heads, and spoke about Europe's capacity to actually defend itself. Now, this is the key thing. Europe has the economic wherewithal, and the more so than the capacity to defend itself, especially against a Russian state, which, let's be honest, in 3 years, against a country 7 times smaller than them, the poorest country in Europe, has made very little progress. Yeah. I think there's this myth of the Russians are going to march to Paris. I don't think that's reality. So what he's saying is that if the U.S. doesn't want to be part of it, fine. We're the European continent, European states are more than capable of doing so. And he's absolutely correct. If you look at economic capacity, what is lacking is political will. Yep. What is lacking is individual leaders that have a gravitas to be able to make the case and make it happen. Yeah. So, by the way, from an Armenian perspective, we should be very much supportive of any kind of a European defense structure, specifically if it's an EU one. Because the moment you set up any kind of an EU equivalent of NATO, you start essentially dismantling NATO, no matter what they say, and the new EU security setup will not have Turkey in it, just by nature, and will never have Turkey in it, except in an alliance format, because Turkey's never going to be in the EU.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I didn't think about that. You had the Europeans who kind of scrambled to put together an emergency meeting. You also have Macron, who's been calling for a long time, even during the first Trump presidency, talking about, Europe kind of taking the lead on its own security, and he kind of sees himself as the main leader of the European Union. That's debatable, of course. Another quiet behemoth in the making is actually Poland, which by the end of this decade will be the
strongest army,
most powerful army on the continent, and they take the Russian threat very seriously, for obvious reasons. So who do you see as emerging as a potential European leader, and how would this impact Armenia's calculations?
Well, I think there's no EU without Germany. So I think the key figure would be the new German chancellor, if he wants to take on that role. But you have to understand the politics of this. Until Europe puts its own house in order first, there's no European army. And putting your house in order first is to control mass immigration, that's what the population is demanding, and to end the continued economic decline of Europe. Those are the first two things. Because if you do not handle those things, you as a political project will not continue. But what you're seeing is essentially blocks appearing. There's the Nordic, Baltic grouping. There's the non-Hungary, Central European that are far more aggressive. So I think what you're going to have much more block action within the EU, with one or two actors trying to block everything, which are the sort of the Russian fifth column within the EU, which is
Hungary and Austria, Slovakia a bit.
So I don't expect unless there's a German leader with gravitas that pulls everyone into this project. I don't see it happening. I do not see. I can see European defenses becoming stronger. A EU army I don't see, because you need a Charles de Gaulle to make that happen, and there's not any of them in the horizon. I don't see it. What's important for Armenia is, given the fact that Armenia's pivot to the West is not just the U.S., it's U.S. and Europe. More options, the merrier. Stronger Europe, stronger European military structure is actually good for Armenia because you already are establishing relationships with them anyway. So it'll just enhance that.
It's also, you mentioned blocs, which is interesting because you have kind of like the France Benelux grouping, and they're very pro-Armenian. We've done extensive work to deepen relations with them. You have the Nordic Baltic groups that, again, we've done extensive work on. As far as I know, we do have some work going with Poland already.
This Poland's changed a lot.
So it's interesting to see that. Listen, both of us, we know our opinions on this. We wish more would be done and faster, but it does seem like Armenia has finally learned to not put all of its eggs in one basket, and so that's
absolutely,
But we do have to be mindful that there does seem to be a bit of a domino, of like a perfect storm, right? Where you have Georgian Dream just north of the border, you've got the EU that's switching towards the far right, and you've got Trump in the US. So all this is unpredictable for us. What advice would you give the Armenian government, the Armenian administration on its current geopolitical setup and pivot towards the West?
We do not have the luxury of picking sides and not having relationships with every faction of this Western, what I call the left-right divide, the corporatists, the oligarchics, whatever. The strategy I'd call the violin strategy, where you hold the violin with the left hand and you play it with the right hand. So you have to play both. As far as the old establishment, we are the good democratic country moving away from Russia, moving towards democracy, free markets, and all these things, all the narratives that they want, we have. With the new right, frankly, there's absolutely no reason why all of them, and many of them are actually quite favorable to Armenia, Geert Wilders in Holland and others. With them,
Marine Le Pen has been
exactly. With them, we're at the razor's edge of the war against an Islamofascist state that ethnically cleansed 120,000 Christians and has destroyed more Christian monuments than ISIS. So we have to be utterly opportunistic, utterly contradictory from group to group. But what you can't do is you can't put your head in the sand and expect the world to change, to go back to the 1990s world. That doesn't exist. So on the one hand, you have to play with the EU about how the Americans have gone crazy, while you play with the US right or the rising European right on commonalities that they know. And many of these people are people that are actually already favorable to us anyway. One of the big projects for Armenia is actually, given the fact that Europe is just going to become more and more right-wing over time, is to have long-term process, not just on a governmental level, of building relationships, because the AFD might come to power or not, Le Pen might come to power or not in France, but I know Le Pen's ideas and the AFD agenda will be implemented by other parties so they don't come to power. Yeah. So I think when you say multi-vector, this is also ideologically multi-vector, in which you play with the new forces while you have the narrative with the old forces. So is it problematic? Well, of course it's problematic. In some ways, given that Armenia has pivoted west, the older format would have been easier. But, well, we don't have that choice. That doesn't exist. So the object is to be able to integrate into both systems and have avenues of communication and ideological affinity with both systems.
Eric Hacopian, thanks again for coming on the show with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks again for watching Civilnet.